We want to talk a little bit about the lines, the differences that separate Arabs from Turks and Iranians.
Yeah, these are three different languages. And they're not only three different languages, but they belong to three different groups. They are totally unrelated languages.
Right.
Arabic is a Semitic language, related to Hebrew. Turkish is a Turco-Tatar language, related to Tatar and Mongol, and more distantly to Hungarian and Finnish. And Persian is an Indo-European language, related to the languages of India and more distantly to the languages of Europe. I mean, in Persian, father is Pedar, and mother is Madar, and brother is Beradar. That tells you to which language family it belongs. Kinship terms are basic.
So much for the claims of pan-Islam.
Yeah.
I mean,
you have these three languages, which, as I say, are not only different, but unrelated, except, of course, for the large vocabulary of Arabic loanwords
right.
in both, and a lot of Persian loanwords in Turkish.
That's a very important distinction.
Yes.
Fundamental, I think. Maybe to the uninitiated, these people have striking similarities, but we know they don't. We know that the Persians are completely sui generis in many ways, and we know that the Arabs are very different. We know the Turks are very different, and I know that one way of thinking about this, I learned from you, that it depends on whether you define Turkey as a European country or a Muslim country. It depends on where do you enter Turkey. And so what about these lines and differences?
Yes, well, most people from the Western world who go to Turkey go from the West, from Europe or America, and arrive in Istanbul. I first set foot in Turkey from the south. I had spent some time in Syria, and before that in Egypt. And my first experience of Turkey was in Ankara and other places around there, and later in Istanbul. And I think I may say, you're quite right, Fouad, that this has really shaped my perception of the country ever since, having come from the south and the past instead of from the west of the present.
Yes.
But there is another point which I think is important, the difference between the Turks and the Persians on the one hand and the Arabs on the other. It was the Arabs, of course, who created the great Islamic state and the great Islamic civilization from the 7th century onwards. But then, as we know, the Arabs lost control. They lost control of the civilization of the state which they themselves had created. And they became a subordinate element. And the Middle East was ruled or contested by non-Arabs, mainly Turks, and then from the 16th, 17th century onwards, Persians as well. Now, Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Persia, whichever you like to call it, are real countries in the European sense of that word. Let me explain what I mean. In Europe, there's a country which is called Denmark, inhabited by people called Danes who speak a language called Danish. There's a country called Spain, inhabited by Spaniards who speak a language called Spanish, and so on and so on. And their loyalty to their country is known as patriotism. That pattern does not apply anywhere in the Arab world, with the possible exception of Saudi Arabia, a very problematic exception. It does apply very clearly in Iran, and in a different way in Turkey. Iran is a country of great diversity of population. If you look around it, there are all sorts of ethnic minorities. There are Turks of various types. There are Arabs. There are Baluchis. There are Kurds. But they have a clearly defined common sense of identity. The difference is that in Iran, they have patriotism. In the Arab countries, they have nationalism.
That's a big difference.
It's a very big difference. You can't have patriotism where you don't have a clearly defined relationship with the country. In Iran, they are patriots. And the same is true in a somewhat different way in Turkey. We've been calling the country Turkey for 1,000 years. In Turkey, they only adopted the name after the First World War. This was a European name because it wasn't the local pattern. We think of, let's say, Denmark inhabited by Danish-speaking Danes, Turkey inhabited by Turkish-speaking Turks. It's obviously the same pattern. No, it isn't obviously the same pattern. because they didn't see it that way. We have, for example, reports. I spent a lot of time reading diplomatic reports in both ways, including reports from Ottoman ambassadors who were sent to various places in Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries. And a recurring theme is they are angry and insulted when they are referred to as a Turkish ambassador. Because for them, at that time, Turk meant the peasants and nomads of Anatolia.
So they wanted to be Ottoman.
Ottoman ambassador,
Right.
or the ambassador of the Islamic Caliph.
Right.
Turkish was insulting. It's only in much more recent times that Turks have accepted to call themselves Turks. Previously, as I say, it was an ethnic term. It was not. It was a social term and a derogatory one. So in Iran, very much so. In Turkey, to a lesser but still very significant extent, you have patriotism as distinct from nationalism. And I think that that is a very, very important distinction. In the Arab world, the nearest approach to patriotism, I would say, is in Egypt. Would you agree with that?
In terms of the sort of looking at these three populations, the Arabs, the Persians, and the Turks, again, in that kind of way, we shouldn't do national characters, but we do. You know, there is some power to these national portrait studies. What strikes me about the Persians, if the Turks are indeed very earnest, I think the Persians were extremely creative.
Yes.
You know, I think of one of these great scholars. England was blessed with many of them, as we know. E.G. Browne, who was, of course, the scholar on Persia.
Right.
He had this wonderful description, and he said, Persia is a hotbed of philosophical system. It's a hotbed of philosophical system. That the Persians have argued philosophy. They argued metaphysics. They were deeper. There were more layers to Persian civilization and to
Right.
Persian identity than there were either in the case of the Arabs or the case of the Turks. Is that wrong, or?
No, I would agree with that up to a point. I mean, when the Arabs came out of Arabia in the 7th century and conquered all these countries of ancient civilization, the previous identities were totally lost.
Right.
I mean, Egypt, after all, was the home of a very ancient civilization going back millennia. The Egyptian language survived for a little while in the form of a Coptic dialect, then disappeared. The Babylonian past was obliterated. Only in Iran, they didn't preserve much, but they did preserve a separate sense of identity. They did preserve their language to some degree. They were not Arabized as the Iraqis and the Syrians and the Egyptians were. They still have a different language, full of Arabic loanwords, Islamized, written in the Arabic script, but still Persian. And in that sense, I think and of course, although they had forgotten their history, they had a very rich mythology to replace it.
Right. Right. Now, the Turks are without that historical depth. Is that fair enough?
I think so, yes.
I mean, do the Turks know that? Does it bother? I mean, is there a kind of, because my impression, correct me on this one, is that the Arabs and the Turks and the Iranians don't know each other very well.
I think that's true.
You know, by and large, their dialogue has been
Yes.
with the West.
Yes.
Each one. I mean,
Yes, you're right. They don't know each other very well.
You know, the Arabs, for example, they decided to do something very interesting with their 4 centuries in the bosom of the Ottoman world.
Yeah.
They decided it was a time of darkness.
Yeah.
False, but that was the new nationalist historiography.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the literature from the period of the great Turco-Persian rivalry,
Right.
from the 16th century onwards for a while, Turkey and Iran were the two great powers of the Middle
Of
East,
course.
contesting supremacy. And they generally write about each other in very insulting terms.
Right.
I mean, the Iranians, speaking of the Turks, refer to them as Atrak, Napak, Bi-Idrak. Atrak is the Arabic plural.
Right.
Napak, impure.
Right.
Bi-Idrak, without understanding.
Right. So that's the image that they have of them.
Yes.
Yes.
The rhymed insult is very popular in that part of
Yes.
the world.
So these populations really don't quite know. I mean, the way they've spent a lot of time defining their identity and their grievances
Yes.
against the West.
Right.
But
But
there
that's
is no
not modern, of course.
That's modern. That is modern.
Previously, the religious identity was the all-important one.
Yes.
And within the religious identity, it was dynastic.
Yes.
The state of which you were a subject.
Right.
The ruler to whom you owed allegiance.
Free populations. Yes. Do you think the Iranians can make themselves, if you will, a factor in the life of the Arabs, given their own temperament, given their own identity? I mean, I ask this question because...
Yes, I doubt it.
Yes.
Even under the present regime, this is an Iranian state, right. And its primary loyalty is patriotism.
Right. Its primary loyalty is to the idea of a Persian nation.
I think so.
Yes.
That's the impression I have.
What do you make of this very, very facile thing? Because, you know, we can only think about these great civilizational questions in very facile ways, such as the predilection about the revival of the Shia. You know, that somehow or another, all of a sudden, we're in the middle of a Shia revival.
Well, that's certainly happening in Iran.
Yes.
How far it'll go, I don't know.
Yes.
I'm a historian, not a prophet. I deal with the past, not the future.
Not the future, exactly. But nevertheless, I mean, is that a revival of Shiaism, or is this just basically the...
I don't think it's a revival of Shiism. I think it's an exploitation of Shiism by the regime.